and talk us through how much of a problem are they to the equestrian industry and to our pet horses?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue, and because of this real thing called wormer resistance. So we were getting these parasite problems in horses until about the 1960s. And then the pharmaceutical companies came up with these worming drugs, these chemicals, which killed the worms. And it really then helped the horses and to be free of the problems of parasite infection. And it was so effective that we were told worm every 8 to 12 weeks with these chemicals, and then you'll be absolutely fine. And so we had a few magic years where parasites faded into the background of being a problem, all was golden, and like life carried on sweetly. And then we realized in the back end of the sort of 90s, particularly probably a little bit earlier in the real kind of scientific side of things, that there was this thing brewing called resistance. So just like antibiotics, we've got this problem where the worms develop and they develop resistances to the medications that we have. And slowly over time, these develop so that then the worms are no longer impacted by the drugs as well as they are. And then the drugs become less and less useful. And that's really, we're getting to a crisis point now with the medications that we've got available. So we've only got 5 licensed chemicals to treat worms in horses. And there is now documented resistance to every single one of those. And as time goes on, and as we expose the worms time again, that is just going to get worse. So we really need to sit up and take notice and change our ways. So we're getting to a point, and we've seen this in other species, like with sheep, where you can no longer keep animals on particular land where they've used a lot of wormers because all the parasites that are there have got this drug resistance. And we're creeping along that way with our horses. It's really worrying times. So I hate to be like, start off on a downer and bring a bearer of bad news, but this is where we're at. So what we're really challenging people to do is to step in, use fewer wormers, and to use the science instead that's on our side so that we can only give the wormers where we need, keep them effective for as long as possible, which then is hopefully going to allow other things to come in to give us the opportunity to treat worms effectively and keep our horses safe. Because, I mean, the real thing is that we've got all these advances in veterinary medicine, and yet it could be these little ankle biters, these little parasites that could actually be the undoing of our ability to keep horses, to keep them safe, to keep them healthy. And that in turn has a real big industry-wide effect on businesses, on livery yards, on studs, like anywhere where we keep horses. If we can't keep them there anymore, or we can't keep them at the stocking densities, then they just become economically not viable. And that's a real big worry, right?
I was going to say, Claire, please do be the bringer of bad news if it means that we can all learn from you and from what you've got to tell us. Because I think also there's so many myths and so many traditions that already exist at our livery yards and our stud farms and at our riding schools. It does get very confusing. I've been to lots of different yards and everyone does their own thing, but often it's a very strict practice. Everyone must worm now, whether you want to go about and do your worm test and your fecal ebb count, but actually they already have a practice in place that everyone has to adhere to. So Claire, can you walk us through what we should be doing with our horses right now in this problem that we're facing?
Yeah, I can totally identify with the situation. Things have changed an awful lot. Westgate was 25 years old this year. So that's that long that we've been putting out this message and supporting people to use test-based parasite control. But there's been, as you say, lots of different ways of doing things. We had our regular chemical programs, and then the drugs changed, and this, that, and the other. But actually, what's best practice now is really getting our testing in, testing first, and then only giving the wormers when we actually need to, when the situation shows that. And we're not also trying to eradicate worms, because we know that's impossible. So instead, we're looking at what can we test? Where is the level at which a horse and a worm can live happily together, like a worm burden, without causing problems? Because we're getting science now from human medicine that shows that a small worm burden can actually be beneficial to horses. So just like in humans, when we eradicate all bacteria, pathogens, viruses, and everything else, we get autoimmune diseases. the same can be true of our horses, because that evolution and the immune system has developed alongside of that. We've already talked about the history and the millennia. And there is a thinking that actually worms, because they want to thrive and survive in the horses, have this secretion that actually is a gut soother. So in small amounts, they are not a bad thing. However, we know we get to a point with parasite infection where they can cause all sorts of diseases, from just weight loss, anemia, those sorts of things, blood loss, colic, something that's going to strike fear into a lot of horse owners. And that can be from impaction, from cutting off blood supply to the large intestines. There's a migratory phase that goes to the lungs, which can cause respiratory damage with ascarids and those parasites. And then ultimately there's death, and overwhelm can lead to that in horses. And it's incredibly sad that we can get to that situation. And once that was a proviso of ignorance and neglect, and now more and more that's being seen due to these resistance issues that we're facing. So we're giving the wormers, but we're just not double checking that they're working effectively. And therefore you're putting all these expensive chemicals in, and yet the outcome is that they're not effective, and that we still get these parasite burden buildups, and then that impacts the horse from a pathogenic point of view. Yeah, it's really important that we are looking at evidence-based control, which is really now what we are purporting that people do as their first port of call. So instead of reaching for the wormer, we're going to do a worm egg count would be the cornerstone of that. And then we've also got the Equisol tapeworm test. And they're the two tests really that we want to be doing through the year, particularly the worm egg counts regularly. And that's based on the life cycle of the particular parasites. And then we're only then stepping in with a wormer to treat those particular horses that are over a certain number of eggs per gram on their test results. And that's the way that we're going to start to keep them healthy. So having an overview of what's going on in the horses, but not using that regular chemical exposure, which is what's speeding this resistance problem